returned to Israel at the end of August and came back last night. My purpose was try to make sense of what's happening since October the 7th, to see whether there are any discernible way for Israelis to end their endless wars and achieve a definitive settlement of Palestinians. And also I wanted to begin investigating the trajectory of some social and demographic trends in Israeli society and what those trends say about the long-run viability of the State of Israel. I also visited the West Bank and some settlements, but in this talk I'll confine my remarks mostly to Israel itself. A caveat. I think it is difficult for somebody who is non-Jewish to fully comprehend the devastating impact of the assault of Hamas on the 7th of October 2023 on the Jewish psyche. Over 1,200 killed, including 800 civilians, accompanied by barbaric acts of rape and sexual abuse. Over 200 hostages taken. It was the largest killing of Jews since the Holocaust, triggering a pervasive trauma in the deepest recesses of their collective memories. It altered perceptions of safety, upended everybody's life, and videos of the account by survivors are hammered into their consciousness every day on every social media platform and news broadcast. Everywhere to this day, almost a year on, there are yellow ribbons around trees, backpacks, car doors, photos of the hostages plastered in every wall, and demands to bring them home. Israel is saturated in sorrow and doubt, fear and loss. October 7th put a question mark beside one of Israel's founding beliefs, that Israel would provide a safe home for the Jews of the world. Just some background. Since 1948, Israel has engaged in 4 wars with Arab states, 3 wars with Lebanon, including 22 years occupying southern Lebanon, 2 intifadas with Palestinians, 5 rounds of war with Hamas in Gaza, now a 6th, a round of exchanges with Iran that brought war between the 2 countries to a catastrophic brink, and now an escalating conflict with Hezbollah. I'm skipping. I left Israel yesterday. On the way to Ben Gurion Airport, my driver had an app on his phone, all Israelis are told to download it, that allowed us to see and hear in real time the hiss of the Hezbollah rockets as they fell in northern Israel, and the dull thud and explosion once they found their targets. Hezbollah began shelling Israel on October the 8th in support of Hamas and vows to continue until there is a ceasefire. A year on, as I said, Israel is still engulfed in anger, fear and anxiety, deeply divided, but not over the occupation. Hundreds of thousands protest every week calling for a ceasefire and return of the hostages and early elections, but not for an end to the occupation. The opening war front with Hezbollah is taking attention away from the hostages and the question of a ceasefire, and you're left to wonder whether this is part of Netanyahu's grand scheme to keep himself in power and slowly drag the United States into a regional war with Iran. This escalating war with Hezbollah really suits Donald Trump. Soon we will see gas prices begin to rise at the gas pump just weeks before the election, and that plays into just his whole election campaign. So one just must wonder.
Please no.
In Gaza, Israel is now juggling potential or actual conflicts on several fronts with perennial enemy Iran, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthi in Yemen, in Gaza, and in the West Bank. In Gaza, it has become bogged down. Although the IDF has immensely degraded Hamas's military capacity and assassinated most of its senior military and political personnel, once the IDF, that's the Israeli Defense Force, declares an area as a safe zone in Gaza and moves on, the remnants of Hamas pop up again, classic guerrilla-style operation requiring the IDF to return, and this cycle is repeating itself over and over. Hamas is like the mythical creature Hydra, decapitated, and two new heads emerge. It is widely believed that Netanyahu cannot call a ceasefire without the approval of the religious Zionist party headed by Bezalel Smotrich, the powerful Minister of Finance, and the Jewish power leader Itamar Ben-Gvir, who two far-right religious parties that prop up his coalition. They oppose a ceasefire until Hamas is eliminated. What that means is unclear. Perhaps the assassination of Yahya Sinwar, the architect of the October 7th assault and now head of Hamas, would suffice. The IDF says the war in Gaza is for all intents and purposes over. But mopping up operations will continue. The Israeli-Hezbollah war will continue on October the 8th, will continue until a ceasefire in Gaza is reached. On each side of the Lebanese-Israeli border, over 100,000 people have been evacuated. In part to refurbish his political rehabilitation, Netanyahu has vowed to return them to their homes. The army's focus has moved to the northern front, and we are seeing a daily escalation of this conflict. Israel's Air Force bombing South Beirut, Hezbollah's Shia stronghold, and targeting its missile launching sites. Hezbollah rockets reaching deeper into Israel, but not yet targeting Tel Aviv. Were it to do so, we will have a full-scale regional war. The widespread explosion of pagers last week, which ostensibly target members of Hezbollah, resulting in over 50 deaths and 1,000 injuries, was hailed as a technological feat. But its strategic purpose, other than bringing a war with Hezbollah closer, is unclear, as with many of the decisions of the Netanyahu government. Michael Walther, the Jewish author of Just and Unjust Wars, and regarded as an authoritative voice on the subject, called the operation a war crime in a sharply worded opinion piece in the New York Times, because those pagers were in the hand of no number of civilian incompetents and children. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, called it a violation of international law. The word Israeli Jews that I interviewed used most frequently to describe October the 7th was shock. Israel is fixated on having total control over the security situation on all its contested borders, having had peace in camps since 2014, had lost control. The Abraham Accords, normalizing relations with several of the Arab neighbours, had sidelined the Palestinian issue. The IDF, always promulgated as the world's most modern, most sophisticated and moral, had been defeated and embarrassed by a crude gang of terrorist barbarians. It would take its revenge. Its intelligence services, Mossad and Shin Bet, regarded as the world's best with the legendary feats of espionage to their credit, missed the multiple cues that October the 7th was about to happen, and one report with specific details of when and how it would unfold. October the 7th was a systems breakdown on all fronts. Most Israeli Jews I interviewed with, said they, meaning Hamas, wanted to kill all of us. Gaza, they said, was a self-governing entity since 2005, when Israel pulled out and evacuated its settlements. It could, they said, have become Singapore on the Mediterranean, the very same words I heard over 10 years ago. Instead, with Hamas's brutal rule, it built an underground military with money from Qatar that could have been used to improve the livelihood of its impoverished citizens. There was near to absolute rejection of any suggestion that Israel had imposed a total blockade on Gaza. In every conversation, Hamas is always referred to as the terror group, dissociating it from any political cause. Most Palestinians, of course, refer to it as a resistance group. There is absolutely no recognition of the fact that Hamas had its roots in the First Intifada, and that the First Intifada was a result of the occupation. Similarly with Hezbollah, founded in Lebanon during Israel's occupation of Lebanon in the early 1980s as a resistance movement. October the 7th, they said, was a mini Holocaust, just justifying whatever means were necessary to eliminate the threat. Every day on mainstream media, the events of October the 7th, I am told, are played over and over. There is no forgetting, only new details of that day to feed the appetite for revenge. In response, a nation that promised itself never again sought absolute revenge, not just to eradicate every vestige of Hamas from Gaza, but to do so with a ferocity that would send a message to all would-be enemies that there would be no lengths Israel would not go to defend itself. The demand for vengeance was absolute, unforgiving, and accompanied by an insatiable, all-consuming rage. Any attack, from whatever source, would be met with an overwhelming, disproportionate response. Flatten Gaza, homes, mosques, hospitals, schools, everything that Hamas could use to launch its missiles at Israel or deemed above Hamas's underground command centers or sites where Hamas snipers could target Israeli groups on the ground, all were legitimate targets. The population, if not overt supporters of Hamas, were complicit in its activities in other ways. Repeatedly I was told that the kibbutzim Hamas attacked were mostly the homes of lefties or peaceniks, civilians who wanted an end to the occupation, who employed Gazan labor and tried to help their families. These Gazans, some asserted, were Hamas spies collecting information on the kibbutzim families. When I quoted figures, perhaps 41,000 dead, 91,000 injured, 63 tonnage of bombs, 208 2,000-pound bombs, unknown thousands still buried under rubble, 80% of homes not habitable. There were Hamas propaganda figures, I was told. The IDF took every precaution to forewarn civilians of the targets it intended to destroy. Every death is Hamas's fault. Bad things happen in war. Even in a just war, there may be unjust acts. And what about the carpet bombing of Dresden in World War II? At least 25,000 dead over 2 nights. Or Hiroshima, between 70 to 80,000 instantly dead. Why is Israel held to a different standard? Nor let Israel confine its vengeance to Gaza. It shut down the West Bank, banning 150,000 Palestinians who work in Israel from entry, with a devastating impact on the Palestinian economy. It established a new framework of checkpoints and roadblocks, making movement between villages difficult as the IDF monitors entry and exit roads. Over 700 checkpoints, 261 settlements, 1 in every 10 Israelis have their home in a settlement. Since October the 7th, the Israeli government has orchestrated the largest seizure of Palestinian land since the Oslo Accords half a century ago, all in violation of international law. The IDF protects many of these settlements, corrupting its mission and shifting an army founded to protect Israel from external threat to one that protects Jews illegally settled in the West Bank. Although it assists Israel on security matters, Israel has refused to turn over tens of millions in taxes it collects on behalf of the Palestinian Authority. The IDF has conducted innumerable raids on West Bank refuge camps, especially Jenin, took arm, frequent airstrikes, killing 1,000, detained 9,400 Palestinians without charge, detention without charge, administrative detention. Every Palestinian arrested was a combatant, according to Israel, just by virtue of being arrested. In Hebron, curfews are imposed from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. Ultra-Orthodox ministers in key cabinet positions in Netanyahu's right-wing government, especially Smotrich, who has taken steps to transfer governance in the West Bank from military occupation to the government, thus advancing annexation of the West Bank in a de facto way. Militancy in the West Bank is rising. There is increasing talk of another intifada as conditions to live are becoming intolerable. A majority support Hamas and despise the PA, especially the PA leader Mahmoud Abbas. Among most interviewees, there was little empathy for the devastation wreaked on Gaza. For months, there was the question of who will govern Gaza after the day or when this operation was over, when Hamas was eliminated. The question has receded from public consciousness. The Netanyahu government has appointed General Ghassan Alian to oversee the distribution of aid in Gaza, suggesting that Israel is intent on some kind of continuing occupation. To put it bluntly, the respondents were saying, we have to kill them before they kill us. A trauma-infused response. This kind of response led me to ask whether there was too much memorialization of the Holocaust, trapping Israel in the past, trapping it into seeing itself as the eternal victim, justifying every threat as existential, which therefore must be met with disproportionate force, fostering a sense of siege and a militaristic society. Every criticism is anti-Semitic, somehow an implicit denial of their historical trauma. In a seminal and controversial essay for the newspaper Haaretz in November 1988, the eminent philosopher Yehuda Elkanan, an Auschwitz survivor, argued that, quote, democracy's very existence is endangered when the memory of past victims takes an active part in the democratic procedure. Using the suffering of the past as a political argument is as good as letting the dead participate in the democratic decisions of the living. Every day I am told everyone has a Holocaust moment. This kind of response led me to ask whether the constant invocation of the Holocaust entrapped people, as we witnessed on October the 7th, that every threat from whatever source is existential, and then certain reflex responses follows. When the aim of every threat is to eliminate all Jews, every threat must be met with whatever force is necessary to eliminate the threat. Thus, Israel lashes out with disproportionate force to every perceived army. Thus, Israel is involved in an endless cycle of wars to achieve absolute deterrence, but without a strategic goal. Thus, Israel is above international law, because international law cannot address wars where the enemy has genocidal intent. The foundings of the International Court of Justice and calls for ending the occupation fall mostly on deaf ears, are driven in large part by perennial anti-Semitism. The one thing most of my Israeli interviewees rarely mentioned was the occupation. It is psychologically buried. As regards two states, just 21% according to a very recently released poll. The preferred outcome, 42% are for annexation of the West Bank and apartheid rule. I should add that in that poll, Palestinians were asked the same questions. 40% were in favour of a two-state solution, and 1/3 were in favour of an apartheid state, but run by the Palestinians. Okay. Once Israel has the backing of the United States, they do not care about the rest of international opinion. General Alexander Haig, the former chief of staff to Presidents Nixon and Ford, called Israel, quote, the largest American aircraft carrier in the world that cannot be sunk, does not even carry one American soldier, and is located in a critical region for American national security. The indispensable ally with American military funding protects itself with its sponsor, hence no accountability. The US as an enabler, not a facilitator. In conclusion, let me add an observation that I intend to flesh out more thoroughly in the future. Israel lives in denial of its own history, in denial that the current wars in Gaza, and perhaps pending with Hezbollah, have their roots in the occupation, dispossession and suppression of another people. On more than one occasion I heard the mantra that Israel was founded, quote, in a land without people, for a people without land. The Nakba, the forced driven expulsion of between 750 and 900,000 Palestinians in 1948, erasing their villages and expropriating their property and removing every vestige of their ever having been there, of the massacres, particularly the Deir Yassin massacre in 1948, involving at least 107 Palestinian villagers, and Lida massacre in July 48 too, when Israeli forces killed between 250 and 1,700 Palestinian civilians. The ethnic cleansing at the heart of Israel's founding is denied. No school book refers to it. Israeli history gives the events meant cursory attention. Rather, these events are subsumed under the wider Arab-Israeli war. That the occupation is a violation of international law is denied. That October the 7th might have a wider context than Islamic extremists breaching the border with Israeli intent on killing all Jews is denied. And what was disheartening from my visit was an absence of reflection that perhaps October the 7th did not emerge out of a vacuum. But perhaps reflection is a luxury that the national psyche is experiencing only trauma, present trauma and re-triggered trauma. The denialism regarding its founding origins and occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, or lies Israel itself, or what Vaclav Havel called living the lie. Let me just go back and give you some other facts. How are we doing in time?
For another 5 minutes.
5 minutes. Let me go back and just give you some statistics that I find troubling.
As if the narrative wasn't.
Yeah. Israel is becoming more religious and more right-wing. A generation ago, 60% of Israeli children learned in secular state schools. By 2019, only 37% of first graders went to secular schools. Israel's legal, moral and cultural core is increasingly being shaped by Jewish religious law. By 2065, it is projected that 49% of Israeli children under 14 would be Haredi. Over 70% of Israeli Jews aged between 18 and 34 identify as right-wing. In part, this is due to increasing religiosity, but the right-wing swing is also in part due to the right-wing swing wave sweeping European countries. Emigration from the secular core, the productive brains of the start-up nation as Israel brands itself as increasing and rapidly increasing since October the 7th, is offset by the influx of religious Jews motivated to help Israel in its time of peril. This demographic policy is unsustainable in the long run. I'll stop there, okay?
Thanks very much indeed, Ulrich. A pretty somber assessment of the situation.
You think?
So Sundeep was saying, given the history of abuse of Jews by Europeans, and the history of the Crusades and the Holocaust and so on, why is it that this anger is being visited on the Palestinians now rather than on Europeans?
Not on the...
Not on Europeans.
Well, the Palestinian issue had always, or Jewish issue, has always been, at least in my mind, a European issue. And since the Holocaust, no European country will ever take any kind of meaningful anti-Israeli stand. That's just a fact. But the difference I see emerging now is the global South that's becoming an actor, and they relate completely to the Palestinian narrative of colonization, because most of these countries were at some part colonized. So I think you're seeing a shift in global opinion. And I would also add that if in front, in talk, and I know Scott referred to this, I do not think that when the time comes for facilitation, that America should be the facilitator. It cannot be so kind of inherently pro-Israel and yet say we will be a neutral arbitrator. I also mentioned in that same poll, which was that was released last week, that while everybody had little hope about the future two states or apartheid state, when they were asked that if there were a regional settlement of all issues that included a two-state package, 60% of both Palestinians and Israeli Jews would like to see that. So, which means that if there is a future table, it can't be what Camp David was, just with the Palestinians, Israelis and Americans. It has to be a regional table with all the actors and somebody whom everybody agrees is a neutral facilitator.
Thanks, Padraig. I mean, there's two things I would just say, Sundeep. One is that idea of a regional approach was something that you and I almost wrote about 10 or 15 years ago or more, that it would not, and in the article I remember we also said that if it was solved then, you could solve it with Hebrew, Arabic and English. But if you left it 10 or 15 years, you'd need to learn Russian and Chinese as well. And I think, unfortunately, that's the direction. On your specific question of why do Jewish Israelis, and actually wider than Jewish Israelis, why do they respond so negatively when they themselves have suffered so much? One of the things that we know about human beings is that when they are abused, physically or sexually, some of them, a significant proportion, become abusers themselves. If you look at people who have been convicted of physical or sexual abuse, a very large proportion of them were themselves abused, We call it identification with the aggressor. So tragically, you would say, having suffered so terribly, they should understand and not impose it on others, but actually they do the opposite. The second thing is the tendency of us to deflect something aggressive onto someone other than the guilty party. So people will come home from work angry about what's happened and kick the dog and slam the door. And the dog and the door had absolutely nothing to do with it at all. But they cannot take their anger out on the guilty party.
On the boss, for example.
That
Yes,
same
on the
poll,
boss.
John, that same poll had that 90% of Israeli Jews regard themselves as being the most persecuted, dispossessed people in the world, and 90% of Palestinians believed they were the most persecuted, dispossessed people in the world. So you have two societies that, in all, psychologically speaking, are mirror images of each other. Each sees itself as the victim.
And that's the third comment I would make, and that is when people become enemies, they imitate each other more and more. They become more and more like each other. And so, for example, Israel is becoming more and more like Iran, profoundly deeply split, with an overweening influence of fundamentalist religious leaders and so on and so on. So there are a number of things about psychology here that are really profoundly important.